Time with your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian. Today, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Protege, Chapter 17. Nice, huh? Sure is. I've never driven a Lexus before. Well, don't get too used to it, Jerome said. You saw how hard it was to get my dad to agree to let us borrow it, and this is a life-or-death situation. Getting his dad to loan them the car had turned out to be more difficult than Jerome had anticipated. Jerome argued that Cheryl was going to drive, and they weren't going far, only to Becca's to get something that might help him against Freddy. Dawn had been reluctant to let Jerome leave the house after what had happened last night, and Lynn had been less than thrilled to hear Becca's name invoked in her house again. But in the end, they both gave in, as much for Cheryl as for him. Now, they sat in the front of Don Starkey's prized Lexus, Cheryl behind the steering wheel and Jerome only a passenger. He was a bit jealous of Cheryl. His dad hardly ever let him drive the car, but in his condition, sleep-deprived, hand-burned, and the target of an undead lunatic, Jerome knew he wasn't in any shape to drive. Besides, he was nervous as hell. What if this trinket Becca had whipped up didn't work? He looked out the passenger side window, and when he realized what direction they were going, south instead of northwest, he felt the first stirrings of panic in his gut. "Don't go this way," he said. "This is—" "What?" Cheryl asked. Jerome felt ashamed for telling her this, but he'd never been able to keep any secrets from her. "This way will take us on to Elm, past the old Krueger place. I'd rather not see it right now." "But it's the fastest, most direct route to your aunt's." Cheryl's voice sounded calm enough, but Jerome thought he detected a hint of exasperation in her tone. "If Becca's come up with a way to help you, then every moment we delay only places you in danger." Jerome couldn't argue with her logic, and he knew she was only acting out of concern for him. But he couldn't escape the feeling that driving past Krueger's deserted house wasn't the smartest move at the moment. Maybe he was just being overly cautious. After all, it wasn't as if Krueger lived there anymore. He was dead, and his spirit inhabited the dreamscape, not an old construction of rotting wood and crumbling stone. Besides, they were only going to be driving past, not going inside. Still, Becca had said it was Krueger's center of power in the real world. He mustered a smile. "All right, but don't expect me to look at the damn thing." Cheryl smiled back. "You got a deal." Less than a minute later, Cheryl showed and hit the Lexus's turn signal as she came to an intersection. She stopped and turned onto Elm Street. Jerome might have closed his eyes if someone other than Cheryl had been driving. He knew she'd understand if he did, but though he realized it made him a macho jerk, he couldn't bring himself to show that kind of weakness to his girlfriend. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead of them and avoided looking at the house as they drove past. The asphalt was a dull, weathered black. The line painted down the middle faded white. As he stared out the windshield, his eyelids began to grow heavy, and he struggled to keep them open. He pinched the small web of skin between his thumb and forefinger, bit the inside of his cheek nearly hard enough to draw blood. But these actions helped only for a few seconds at best, leaving him feeling even more weary than before. Though he wasn't looking in the direction of Krueger's house, he nevertheless sensed when they were drawing close to it. It was like an invisible weight settled on his shoulders, and the air in the interior of the Lexus suddenly became too thick and stale to breathe. The sensations became increasingly oppressive, until finally Jerome couldn't stand it anymore, and he turned to look. Krueger's house sat in the middle of its barren lawn like a spider squatting in the middle of its web. Jerome had the impression that the house had been waiting for him to pass by. He blinked several times, his eyelids suddenly heavy as stone, and he heard a single word whisper through his mind. "Sleep." If it hadn't been for the reason behind the trip, Cheryl would have enjoyed driving Mr. Starkey's Lexus a lot more. The car was only a couple years old and still in great condition. But she wasn't capable of appreciating the experience, wasn't capable of feeling anything beyond worry for Jerome. He might have died in last night's accident, might still die, just like his mother, if they couldn't find a way to stop Krueger, or at least keep him away from Jerome. She prayed that whatever Becca had come up with would do the trick. She loved Jerome so much, and she couldn't bear for anything to happen to him. Jerome's head lolled forward, his eyes closed. Cheryl felt a jolt of fear. Oh my God, was he asleep? "Jerome, are you all right? Jerome!" She took her right hand off the steering wheel and started to reach for Jerome, intending it to shake him. But before her hand made contact, he lifted his head, eyes wide open and alert. "Are you okay, sweetie? You nodded off there for a second." Jerome turned to look at her, his head swiveling slowly and deliberately. His face remained expressionless for a moment, but then his lips formed a smile. "I'm fine." His smile grew wider. "Fine and fucking dandy." Cheryl had never been to Becca's place before, and as she pulled Mr. Starkey's Lexus into the driveway, she had to admit she was disappointed. Becca's house looked nothing like the place where a psychic lived and did business. To the right of the door, a small sign was bolted to the brick. Spiritual advisor, Monday through Friday, 10 to 8, Saturday 10 to 6, closed on Sundays. But otherwise, there was nothing to mark Becca's place as special. It was a 2-story Cape Cod with red brick, dark green shingles, and shutters to match. The yard was well kept, the grass neatly trimmed, flower beds with blooming tulips and daffodils well tended. It was almost stultifyingly normal. Jerome opened the passenger door before Cheryl had put the Lexus in park. By the time she'd done so and shut off the engine, he was halfway up the small set of concrete steps that led up to the porch. As she got out of the car, she said, "Hey, wait up, Mr. Impatient." It was just a joke, mostly. But Jerome froze on the second step and didn't turn around right away. Cheryl crossed the walkway and started up the stairs herself before he turned to face her. He smiled easily enough, but he stood stiffly, body tight with tension. And there was an intensity in his eyes, a cold scrutiny that made her almost take a step back. "Sorry, guess I'm just excited." He said nothing more, but his eyes narrowed, and Cheryl had the impression that he was waiting to see if she would accept his explanation. He's been through a lot the last couple days, she told herself, and he didn't get any sleep last night. Add to that all the coffee he's been drinking to help him stay awake, and it's no wonder he's acting a little strange. She returned his smile, took his hand, and gave it a squeeze. He didn't respond to her touch. His hand was like a lifeless lump of flesh in hers. But she kept smiling and said, "Come on, let's go." Jerome hesitated a moment, then nodded, and together they stepped onto the porch and up to Becca's front door. Cheryl expected Jerome to open the door and walk in. It was his aunt's house after all. But instead, he opened the screen door and knocked. A moment later, Becca opened the door and Cheryl nearly gasped in surprise. She'd last seen Becca early this morning at the hospital, and she'd looked tired and stressed then. But only a few hours later, she looked as if she'd aged 10 years, if not more. If Jerome was surprised by his aunt's appearance, he gave no sign. Becca smiled sadly. "I didn't mean to startle you. I should have warned you about my appearance when I called. But as fast as everything's been moving, it just didn't occur to me." "That's all right," Jerome said. "No biggie." Becca frowned as she looked at her nephew, squinting her eyes almost as if she were trying to look inside him somehow. Jerome just stood expressionless as Becca scrutinized him. And after a moment or two passed, she broke eye contact with Jerome and shook her head. "Sorry. For a moment there I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought, does it? Come on in." Becca stepped back to make room for them to enter. Cheryl started forward without thinking. For normally Jerome, gentleman that he was, let her go first. But this time he brushed past her as if she wasn't there, and she had the feeling that if she'd been any closer to the doorway, he might have knocked her aside. He's just nervous, she told herself, and who could blame him considering everything that he'd been through? He was no doubt anxious to find out what Beck had come up with to help protect him from Freddy Krueger. Still, the casual disregard for her feelings, for her, wasn't like Jerome, wasn't like him at all. Cheryl tried not to worry about it as she entered Becca's house. Jerome's aunt would help him, and everything would be better. It had to be. Becca continued talking as she led Jerome and Cheryl through the foyer and into a room that, given the white cloth-covered table with a crystal ball resting on its surface, was obviously where Becca conducted her business. "My efforts to help restore the dream catcher took more out of me than I thought they would." Her voice was soft and breathy, and the words seemed to come to Becca with more effort now. "But I suppose you already guessed that, eh?" She chuckled, but her laughter ended in a series of dry, rattling coughs. She stopped walking and started to sway, as if she were having a difficult time maintaining her balance. Cheryl expected Jerome to step forward and help steady his aunt, but when he didn't, Cheryl went to her side. She put an arm around Becca's waist, which was tiny and felt fragile as an abandoned bee's nest, and helped the woman over to her chair at the table. Becca sat with an audible sigh and gave Cheryl a grateful look. "Thanks, hon." 10 years, Cheryl thought. It's more like she's aged 30 or 40. "Sit down," Becca said, not quite an order, but more than a request. Cheryl glanced at Jerome, but his face remained expressionless as he took one of the remaining chairs at the table. Sensing that something was wrong, but unable to say what, Cheryl sat in the chair next to Jerome. The crystal ball wasn't the only object resting on the table. In front of Becca was a miniature version of the dream catcher that until the night before last hung over Jerome's bed. Becca gestured at the object with a hand that trembled as if she had Parkinson's. "This is it, Jerome. I couldn't repair your dream catcher, and I couldn't recreate it, not entirely. But with another sad smile, a little extra help, I was able to make this. It's a medallion, not quite as powerful as your original dream catcher, I'm sorry to say, but it contains enough psychic energy to present a formidable defense against Krueger. If you start wearing it all the time, and you religiously practice certain meditative techniques I'll teach you before you go to sleep every night, you should be fine." Jerome looked at the medallion, and though Cheryl saw something move behind his eyes, she couldn't tell what he was thinking. So she examined the Dreamcatcher medallion more closely to determine what, if anything, he might see in it. "Nothing personal, Becca, but I don't feel any power radiating from it," Cheryl said. Then again, I didn't feel any power when I was around Jerome's old Dreamcatcher, though sometimes I did get kind of a strange feeling from it. But maybe that was just my imagination. She felt as if she were babbling, but she couldn't stop herself. Jerome's silence was beginning to make her nervous. "As I said, the medallion's less powerful than the original Dreamcatcher. I'm not surprised you don't sense anything from it." Becca looked at the medallion and gently ran her forefinger around its circumference. "Truth to tell, I can't sense much about it either. Creating the medallion tapped my deepest reserves of psychic energy, in effect making me psi-blind. Whether my abilities will ever return, I don't know. But even if they don't, their loss is a small price to pay for keeping Jerome safe from Krueger." Cheryl had never had any doubt that Becca loved Jerome, but now she truly understood the depth of that love. For Becca, sacrificing her psychic power would be the equivalent of Cheryl giving up her eyesight or her hearing. Cheryl loved Jerome too, loved him more than anyone she'd ever known, her parents included. But even as much as she loved Jerome, could she make such a sacrifice for him? She didn't have time to think about it for long. Of course she could. Becca lifted the Dreamcatcher medallion by its leather strap and held it out to Jerome. "Here, take it and put it on." Jerome hesitated, but then he reached out and took hold of the medallion. Becca withdrew her hand, almost reluctantly, Cheryl thought, and rose to her feet. "I almost forgot. I have something else to give you. It's from your mother." She shuffled closer to Jerome, leaned down and kissed him on the cheek. But the moment her lips touched her nephew's flesh, Becca's eyes flew wide, and she pulled her face away from his abruptly, as if she'd experienced an electric shock. Jerome looked up at her, his lips forming a sly smile. "Looks like you're not so side-blind as you thought, huh?" Jerome wrapped his fingers around the miniature recreation of his old Dreamcatcher and squeezed. The sound of snapping wood filled the room, the noise far louder than the destruction of such a small object could account for. Jerome opened his hand and dropped the broken pieces of the medallion onto the table. Cheryl had trouble believing what she had just witnessed. "Jerome, why?" She couldn't bring herself to complete the question, wasn't even exactly sure how to phrase it. "It's because he's not Jerome," Becca said as she slowly backed away from the table. "It's Jerome's body, but the personality and control is not his. It's the other Jerome, the one that Freddy created." Jerome's lip drew back from his teeth in what Cheryl thought might be a grin, but looked more like a snarl. "That's right, you dried-up old hag." He quickly rose to his feet, the abrupt motion knocking over his chair. "Your toy might have worked, too, if my soul brother hadn't been dumb enough to fall asleep and give me a chance to hop into the driver's seat, just for a little while." He glanced at the crystal ball, then at Becca, who continued to slowly retreat, and a wicked gleam came into his eyes. Jerome placed his hands on either side of the crystal ball and lifted it off its base. "A tool of the trade, eh, Becca? Well, you know what they say. She who lives by the ball dies by the ball." He lifted the crystalline sphere over his head and ran towards Becca. Becca raised her arms to protect herself, but she was too slow, too weak. Jerome, or rather the evil thing in control of his body, brought the crystal ball down on Becca's head. Cheryl watched in stunned horror as Becca's skull exploded like a rotten melon, sending splatters of blood, chunks of brain, and shards of bone flying everywhere. Becca's body shuddered as if 10,000 volts of electricity coursed through it, and then her legs fell out from under her, and she began to go down. Her knees hit the floor with a pair of loud cracks. She remained motionless for a moment, mouth wide, eyes staring, and then she pitched forward and crashed face first to the floor. Jerome regarded Becca's corpse for a moment before turning his attention to the crystal ball. Its surface was slick with blood, and he gazed at it for a long moment, as if he were contemplating a work of art. Then he set the crystal ball back down on its base, speckling the white tablecloth with blood, and used his index finger to clean off 2 round spots in a half circle. With a dizzying twist of nausea, Cheryl realized he'd drawn a smiley face in Becca's blood. Jerome smiled at her. "Have a nice day!" Cheryl wanted to scream, could feel a scream wild and insane deep down inside her, desperate to get out. But she just couldn't give voice to it. She was too terrified of what Jerome, this Jerome, might do to her. So like a small, frightened woodland creature that has had the misfortune to suddenly find itself in the presence of a hungry predator, she remained very, very still and very, very quiet, and prayed to Christ that the beast that had hijacked her boyfriend's body would somehow overlook her. His face, hands, and clothes were covered with blood spatter and globs of gray matter that slid off him and fell to the floor with meaty, wet plaps. "Sorry you had to see that, Cheryl. I'd have preferred to wait a while before revealing my true identity to you, at least until I banged you a few times," he laughed. "But I can't afford any loose ends, and neither can my benefactor. So I'm afraid you're going to have to die as well. But not before I've had some fun with you. Think of it as the equivalent of a last meal for someone about to be executed. Only in your case, it's a last fuck. I promise to do my best to make it a good one," he grinned. "Good for me, anyways." He started walking toward her. Cheryl had remained seated during Jerome's attack on Becca, but she rose from her chair, and just as Becca had done only a few moments earlier, she backed slowly away from Jerome's advance. "You may not be Jerome, but I know he's still in there. He loves me, and he won't let you hurt me." Jerome continued coming toward her, leaving a trail of bloody shoe prints behind him. "He loves Becca, too, but you saw how much that helped her. Jerome's not in control anymore, and he's not going to be ever again. Meet the new boss. Definitely not the same as the old boss." Cheryl gazed into Jerome's eyes and tried to see beyond the lust and madness that currently filled them. Tried to see past this thing that had stolen her boyfriend's body, and all the way to her Jerome, the real one. The one that loved her and would never do anything to hurt her, who'd give up his own life to save hers if he could. "Jerome, honey, you saw what he did to Becca. If you don't do something to stop him, he's going to do something worse to me, a lot worse. Please, I love you so much. I don't mind dying if it's my time, but I can't stand the thought that it'll be your hands that take my life. Hands that I've held so many times. Hands that I've kissed. Your hands, Jerome, not his." Jerome stopped advancing and then frowned as if suddenly confused. His facial muscles twitched and contorted, and his whole body began to shake as if he were having a seizure. No, Cheryl thought, as if he were desperately trying to wake up from a dream. Jerome's spasms became more violent as the 2 personalities that inhabited his body battled for control. Cheryl knew that she should take advantage of the Jerome's struggle for control, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon the man she loved, even if he did currently share his body with a homicidal maniac. Only a few seconds later, she had cause to regret her choice to stay as Jerome lurched forward, facial muscles rippling as if they might tear themselves free of his skull any second. And then his fist came swinging toward her face in a vicious arc. A burst of white light exploded behind her eyes as the fist connected with her jaw. Then the light faded, leaving only darkness behind. Jerome stared at Cheryl's prone form lying on the floor in a pool of his aunt's blood. Becca's body lay several feet away, and on the table, the bloody smiley face his other self had created gazed at Jerome with mindless joviality. He killed Becca. Killed Cheryl. No, not him. The other Jerome. The one infested with Freddy's evil. That fucker was responsible. His other self had retreated, leaving Jerome in control once more. But Jerome sensed the other's presence lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness. Like a crocodile submerged in dank river water, only its eyes visible, waiting with inhuman patience for prey to draw near the water's edge. "We did it together, bro. Your body, my wicked, wicked mind." His other self laughed inside Jerome's head, the sound harsh and guttural, just like Krueger. Jerome wanted to jam his hands tight against his ears to shut out the foul laughter, but since it issued from within his own skull, he knew there was nothing he could do. Cheryl stirred and groaned then, and the laughter cut off as if someone had pressed a psychic mute button in his mind. Jerome knelt next to Cheryl and fixed his gaze on her face, not allowing himself to believe she was alive, afraid that her movement had been only another of Krueger's cruel tricks. But after a moment she groaned again and her eyes fluttered, though they didn't open. Thank Christ she was alive. Her jaw was rapidly swelling and already starting to bruise, and Jerome feared it was broken. It was possible she had a concussion too, or maybe a more serious head injury, but at least she was alive, for the moment. But she wouldn't remain that way, not if his other self assumed control again. Though Jerome didn't want to leave her side, though it broke his heart to abandon her when she was hurt, by his own hand, if not his own will, but he knew he couldn't stay. He couldn't risk his other self regaining control and attacking her. Jerome had failed to save Becca, but he was determined not to lose Cheryl as well. And there was only one way he could think of to ensure her safety. He had to get away from her as fast as possible. He reached out to touch her face one last time before he left, but when he saw his fingers were slick with Becca's blood, he pulled his hand back. He stood, then turned and began heading for the front door, leaving behind the two women he cared for more than anyone else in the world, one dead, the other injured and perhaps in need of medical attention. He was determined to make their attacker pay, and pay dearly for what he'd done. And when Jerome was finished with the son of a bitch, he never hurt anyone ever again. Chapter 18. Jerome stood looking down at the river rushing below. It had rained all last week, and the water was brown and sludgy, the level much higher than normal. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the sun had dipped past the trees that dotted the western horizon. Leaving the bridge and the river it stretched across, painted in shadow. If Jerome hadn't known the water below was brown, he might have thought he was looking at a torrent of flowing ink, or perhaps blood so dark it appeared black. Debris bobbed in the churning water, broken tree branches, plastic soda bottles, and at one point what appeared to be the body of a dead dog. Jerome was grateful for last week's storms. The swollen river would make what he intended to do easier. His dad's Lexus was parked at the northern end of the bridge, just off the side of the road, keys still in the ignition. Jerome wasn't going to be needing a ride home. The bridge was located a couple miles outside Springwood, part of a country road that didn't see much traffic, something Jerome was counting on. He gripped the bridge's metal railing and hesitated only a moment before swinging his right leg up and over, followed by his left. He sat on the railing, hands still gripping tight for support, legs dangling out into space. If this had been an urban or even suburban area, the railing would have been built high enough to discourage people from attempting what Jerome was about to do. But this was a country bridge, at least 20 years old. It was the kind of place people drove across or fished from, not jumped off. He gazed down at the water and listened to its sibilant whispering as it rushed by beneath him. He found the sound soothing, and he wished he could sit here and listen to it forever. But he couldn't. He had work to do. He figured it was 30, maybe 40 feet down. Not so far that a drop would prove fatal in and of itself, but then he hadn't expected it to. He was counting on the river to take care of business. Now that he was there and about to go through with it, he was mildly surprised to discover that he wasn't afraid. If he had to die to stop this other self and prevent Krueger from gaining an agent in the real world, then so be it. He only wished that he'd found the courage to take his life earlier. If he had, Becca would still be alive. Once again, he saw Becca lying on the floor of her sitting room, head crushed, surrounded by a widening pool of blood. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to banish the image from his mind. He didn't want to go to his death with that picture in his head. Sorrow gripped him then, so overwhelming that it took all his strength not to break down sobbing. He couldn't afford any weakness, not now. Not until after he'd jumped, and it was too late. He loosened his grip on the railing, but didn't let go. Not yet. He hoped Cheryl would understand and maybe even one day find it in her to forgive him. He wondered if Elle, after the pain of losing a friend had eased somewhat, would be able to make jokes about his high dive someday. Jerome hoped so. He wanted Elle to remember him with laughter. He regretted the pain his suicide would cause his family. Jerome was the last living link his dad had to Joanna Larkin. When Jerome was gone, Joanna would be too, forever. Lynn wasn't his birth mother, but Jerome thought she'd feel sorrow at his loss, maybe even as much as she'd feel at losing one of her biological children. But of everyone he would be leaving behind, Jerome regretted the effect his death would have on his half, on his brother and sister. Brian and Mary were too young to have to experience such loss, and if there was any other way to put an end to Krueger's plan, Jerome would have done it. But he could see no other way, and the longer he hesitated, the greater the chance that his other self, who since Jerome had left Becca's, had been strangely silent, would attempt to reassert control. If Jerome was going to do this thing, he had to do it now. He took a deep breath, removed his hands from the railing, and leaned forward. The moment he began falling, he was seized by panic, and his arms and legs began flailing at their own accord, desperate to find any sort of purchase in the air. Though he was reconciled of dying, wanted death as much as he'd ever wanted anything in life, it seemed his body had its own ideas. His stomach leaped into his throat, and he couldn't breathe. It felt as if his heart suddenly stopped beating in anticipation of a full-body shutdown. A shock of impact accompanied by a sudden bone-numbing cold, and Jerome felt his descent abruptly slow. It took a second for him to realize that he'd hit the water, was in fact beneath it, and then he was tumbling as the river's current took hold of him. He began thrashing, or rather his body did, in a desperate attempt to swim to the surface. But Jerome forced himself to go limp and let the river do with him as it would. To help things along, he opened his mouth and expelled the air his lungs had been hoarding in a gout of bubbles. Then he took a deep breath in. Panic returned as thick, heavy liquid filled his lungs, and his hands clawed the water, trying to pull the rest of his body toward the surface and the sweet air beyond. He took another breath, then another. With each, there was less air in his lungs and more water, and he quickly lost buoyancy. He sank deeper, and while his hands continued to paw the water, their exertions were becoming increasingly feeble. A not altogether unpleasant numbness settled into his body, and a profound sense of peace came over him. He'd done it. He'd beaten Freddy Krueger. Just a few more moments and it would all be over. He felt his consciousness begin to slip into the darkness within his own mind, his interior world mirroring what was happening outside. His spirit, essence, whatever it was called, would be swallowed by darkness, leaving his body to the river's mercy. But just as the everlasting night was about to take him, Jerome had a realization. Once his soul was gone, his body wouldn't be empty. Someone would be left behind. Someone that would no longer have to worry about fighting another personality for control. Someone who'd be free to do whatever he pleased, to whomever he pleased. Jerome knew then that he'd fallen right into Freddy's hands. The bastard had wanted him to commit suicide so his nightmarish offspring could take permanent control of Jerome's body. Even now, with his last remaining shreds of self-awareness, Jerome could sense his other self taking the reins of their body, could almost hear the mocking laughter as he gave voice to his triumph. Jerome tried to resist the darkness pulling him downward, but it was too late. The eternal void claimed his spirit, and he knew no more. Jerome's body crawled onto the riverbank and got onto his hands and knees. With a series of heaving coughs, it expelled the water from its stomach and lungs. When the body could breathe freely once more, it flopped onto its back and lay there for a time, staring up at the darkening sky while waiting for its strength to return. Full night had fallen by the time the body was unsteadily to its feet and began making its way up to the riverbank. It was quite a way downstream from where Jerome had jumped, but that was all right. The personality that was the sole inhabitant of the body didn't mind. In fact, it was rather looking forward to the exercise. Plus, it would give his clothes the opportunity to dry some more. He didn't want to get the interior of the Lexus any more wet than he had to. It was a damn fine car, and it would be a shame to ruin the upholstery. Jerome, the other Jerome, the only Jerome, the once and future Jerome, smiled. He couldn't wait to hop behind the Lexus's steering wheel and return to town. There were some people that he really wanted to see. See dead, that is. Jerome laughed as he continued making his way up the riverbank, his body growing stronger with every step. Gary Hauser sat on a metal folding chair, grading student homework to the soothing sound of working washing machines and dryers. Ever since his own student days, he needed white noise to concentrate. but only recently had he been coming to the laundromat to find it. Not that he came here by choice. 4 months ago his wife had decided that they'd grown apart and needed time alone to find themselves, and then she'd kicked him out of the house and refused to answer the phone when he called. He'd found a cheap apartment downtown, but the building didn't have a laundry room. So once a week he shoved all his dirty clothes into a canvas bag and hauled them here, to the Tidy Rabbit. What the hell a rabbit had to do with the laundromat? He had no idea. But the place had been here for decades. The sign outside depicted a smiling cartoon rabbit in a dress, cleaning clothes using an old-fashioned wooden bucket full of suds and a corrugated washing board. Though the name and mascot of the establishment made no sense to him, they did appeal to the biologist's sense of humor. How many rabbits had he dissected over the years? When he was finished with them, they weren't tidy rabbits anymore. No, they were quite messy rabbits. He was sitting in front of a dryer, and he found himself looking up from his grating to watch through the round glass door as his clothes tumbled around and around. It was almost hypnotic, and far more interesting than reading another poorly written essay on mitosis. The gem of the batch so far had been a nearly unreadable epic, consisting of a grand total of 28 words attempting to define mitosis as a form of bad breath. So when the dryer's time ran out, he noticed, he put the stack of papers on the floor, then stood up, and with an almost pathetic eagerness to do something other than grade, he walked over to the dryer and began fishing in his pants pocket for change. He withdrew a quarter, examined the date it was minted to stall a couple more seconds, it was 1982, then inserted the coin into the appropriate slot and activated the dryer. He watched as his clothes began to tumble once more, knowing they might well be dry already, but not prepared to return to his small and quiet, lonely apartment just yet. "Getting some religion, Mr. Hauser?" Startled, Gary turned toward the voice and was surprised to see Jerome Starkey standing there. "Pardon?" Jerome was smiling, but there was something about the expression that unsettled Gary. The lips seemed stretched a bit too wide, and pulled back from the teeth a bit too far. "You know what they say, cleanliness is next to godliness." It took a second for Gary to get the joke. "Oh, yes, I see. Clever." Not that he thought it was funny especially, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. Jerome didn't respond. He just stood there smiling that strange, wicked smile of his. Gary began to feel nervous and awkward, and not entirely due to Mr. Starkey's odd expression. Like many teachers, he disliked encountering his students outside of school. Not because he hated them, well, not all of them, but because he never had any idea what to say. It certainly didn't help that away from school, any authority he had as a teacher was meaningless. He was just some guy washing his clothes, and Jerome was a kid who no longer even had to pretend to respect him. "We missed you in school today. I heard about the accidents. Everybody did, of course. Miss LeClaire made an announcement during homeroom period. I'm glad you weren't seriously injured, son. It's a shame what happened to Pat Cottrell and the others, though." "Yeah, a real shame." Jerome's reply was toneless, and Gary couldn't tell what, if anything, he was feeling. Must be the shock of the experience, he decided. It had only been a day since the accident, after all. He pointed to Jerome's hand. "Looks like you got burned, huh?" "It's not too bad. See?" Jerome held the hand up for Gary to inspect. The flesh was red and shiny tight, but it didn't look like a recent burn. Rather, it appeared to be one that had undergone a significant amount of healing. Certainly it wasn't an injury from last night's accident. Gary had no idea why Jerome felt the need to lie about his burn, but he decided not to remark on it. Gary caught a whiff of a musty, dank smell, and he noticed Jerome's clothes were damp and had splotches of mud stains here and there. "I can see why you came here, Jerome," he said with a smile. Jerome scowled, and for an instant his entire face darkened in a way that made the hair on the back of Gary's neck stand up. But then Jerome looked down at himself, and his scowl melted into an expression of understanding. "Right," he chuckled, and for some reason the sound made Gary's hackles rise even more. "I was messing around down by the river a while ago, just doing a little extracurricular schoolwork, you know." "I'm surprised you felt up to going anywhere, let alone down to the river." Jerome shrugged. "I started going stir-crazy sitting around the house. I thought if I got out, it might take my mind off things a little bit, you know?" "So, what are you doing here, Jerome? The laundromat seems like an odd place to visit just because you're bored." I came here looking for you, of course. Gary couldn't have been more surprised if Jerome had told him he was there to give Gary $1 million in cash. I don't understand. Not to get too personal, but all the kids in school know that you and your wife have, temporarily parted ways. Some of the kids have seen you in here doing laundry, so I took a chance you'd be here tonight. Looks like I lucked out, huh? Gary was still having difficulty wrapping his mind around the concept of a student willingly seeking him out and after school yet. Sorry, Jerome, but I'm still not following you. I told you I was down by the river. While I was there, I found a really freaky frog. At least I think it's a frog. I've never seen anything quite like it before. I managed to catch it, whatever it is, and I figured I'd show it to you and maybe you could tell me what it is. I gotta say I'm surprised, Jerome. I didn't have you pegged as someone with that sort of scientific curiosity. But why go to all the trouble of tracking me down tonight? Why not just bring this mysterious creature of yours to school tomorrow? That's the thing, see? I'm not exactly experienced at catching animals, and I didn't have a net or anything. I just grabbed it with my hands and, well, I'm afraid I must have squeezed it too tight to keep it from squirming out. I'm sure I heard it, and I think it might be dying. I wanted you to see it before it croaks. No pun intended. Jerome looked at Gary expectantly after he finished. Gary wasn't sure how to take the boy's story. It made sense on the surface, but it seemed out of character for Jerome Starkey. He was a good enough kid, despite yesterday morning's episode of weird behavior. Still, the thought of checking out a mysterious specimen, one that, for the moment at least, was alive, intrigued Gary. Certainly it would be a hell of a lot more interesting than grading essays. Where was it? You're not carrying it around in your pocket, are you? No, it's outside, in the trunk of my dad's car. You want to come out and take a look at it? Gary glanced at the dryer. His clothes still had plenty of time to go in the cycle. So he turned to Jerome. Sure, why not? Jerome smiled. Great! One corner of his mouth rose in a half smile. I think you're going to be very surprised. Wake up, Mr. Hauser. He felt a hand patting his cheeks. Right, then left. He tried to open his eyes, but his head hurt so much that all he wanted to do was go back to sleep until the pain was gone. The hand hit him harder this time, hard enough to jar his head and start it throbbing even worse. The pain was too much to ignore, and despite himself, Gary Hauser opened his eyes. He saw Jerome Starkey kneeling over him. Welcome back to the land of the living, Jerome smiled, at least for a little while. Gary wanted to ask what had happened, but the words came out as muffled mumbling, and he realized he'd been gagged. He tried to sit up then, but Jerome planted a hand on his chest and shoved him back down with surprising strength. Gary fell back to the ground, cracking the back of his head against hard asphalt. The pain in his head quadrupled, and he almost passed out again. But Jerome gave him a hard pinch on the cheek. Stay with me now, Mr. Hauser. It took me long enough to wake you up the first time. Besides, you don't want to miss out on the fun, do you? Gary struggled to remember how he'd gotten there. He recalled grading essays in the laundromat, Jerome arriving and telling him about a strange sort of frog that he'd captured. He remembered following Jerome outside to a Lexus. He recalled that part very well, for he knew he'd never been able to afford a Lexus, pre-owned or otherwise, on his teacher's salary. He remembered Jerome popping the trunk open and gesturing for him to look inside. He'd leaned down into the trunk, looking to see whatever Jerome had in there, but as near as he'd been able to see, the trunk had been empty. He'd been about to ask Jerome if this were some sort of joke when he sensed sudden movement from the boy, and then pain exploded in his head, and he remembered nothing else until Jerome started slapping him. He thought he understood what had happened, though. Jerome had slammed the trunk lid down hard on his head and knocked him out. He then gagged him and brought him here, wherever that was. He tried to turn his head to examine his surroundings, but even the slightest movement set off a fresh wave of agony in his skull, forcing him to lie still. Let me guess, Jerome said, trying to figure out where you are. I didn't take you too far. Oh, sorry. We're in the alley behind the laundromat. As you've no doubt figured out by now, there was no strange frog. That was a lie I used to get you outside so I could knock your ass out, just to make you temporarily more cooperative. You understand? We're about to embark on a little scientific experiment, you and I. Dissecting a frog in class is interesting and all, but I thought I might learn more by dissecting a, more complex organism. and a living one at that. He frowned. Though, isn't it called vivisection when you cut up something that's alive? I guess it doesn't really matter. It's the cutting that's important, right? Jerome smiled, and Gary felt cold terror take hold of him and wipe away the pain in his head. He started to sit up, but Jerome shoved him down again and placed his right foot on Gary's left wrist. Can't have you wriggling while I work, can we? He reached down and picked up a metal spike and a hammer. Brace yourself. This is gonna hurt a bit. Oh, who am I kidding? This is gonna hurt like a son of a bitch. Gary tried to plead with Jerome not to do this, but the cloth gag in his mouth made his words unintelligible. Not that he thought Jerome would pay any attention to them anyway. Jerome kept his foot on Gary's wrist while he placed the spike point first on Gary's palm. He raised the hammer high, his gaze fixed on Gary's eyes, and then he brought it down in a single swift stroke. The spike penetrated the flesh of Gary's hand and dug into the asphalt beneath, pinning him in place. Gary shrieked through his gag as agony beyond anything he'd ever known exploded in his hand and raced through his central nervous system like rapidly spreading fire. 1 down, Jerome said, grinning. 3 to go. Jerome continued driving spikes through Gary's flesh until both arms and both legs were nailed to the asphalt. Gary was sobbing, the pain so intense that he couldn't stand it, but so strong that it denied him the escape of unconsciousness. Gary turned his head, the pain in his head nothing compared to that caused by the spikes, and saw an assortment of tools laid out on the ground next to him. Jerome laid the hammer aside and picked up a pair of garden shears. Not exactly the right equipment, I know, but then the hardware store I stopped at didn't have a biology supply section, so I had to improvise. Jerome used the shears to cut Gary's shirt down the middle. Then he pushed the flap to either side, exposing the bare flesh of the teacher's chest and abdomen. Jerome put the shears down and thoughtfully examined the rest of his tools. What to start with, he wondered aloud. Something sharp, of course, so it makes a clean first cut, but something that won't do too much damage right away. Tears streamed down the side of Gary's face, and he whimpered behind the gag. Jerome brightened. I know! How about this? He picked up an X-Acto knife, thumbed the switch, and a length of ultra-sharp razor blade snicked out its plastic housing. Gary's eyes widened as he stared at the blade. Jerome went to work then, and it was a long time before Gary's eyes closed for good, and before they did, he learned more about human anatomy than he'd ever wanted to know. Chapter 19. Cheryl awoke calling Jerome's name, though she wasn't sure why. She sat up and put a hand to her throbbing head as she struggled to orient herself. Once she saw the smiley-faced crystal ball, the blood all over the floor, and of course Becca's dead body, it didn't take long for her to recall what had happened. She rose to her feet and closed her eyes as a wave of dizziness hit her. She inhaled deeply, hoping it would help the dizziness pass. But she breathed in the stink of blood and death through her nostrils, and her stomach instantly revolted. She turned her face away from Becca's corpse, not wishing to violate the poor woman's body any further, and vomited. When she was finished, she staggered off in search of a phone. Elle was scanning returned movies back into the computer system when the phone rang. He glanced away from the terminal he was working at and checked to see if either of his parents was going to answer it. Dad was out on the floor helping a customer find a movie, and Mom was helping another customer check out. With a sigh, he reached past his mother and picked up the store phone's receiver. Showtime Video, where the stars shine day or night. How may I help you? There was no response at first, and Elle figured it was either a wrong number, who hung up, or an impatient customer who got tired of waiting. He was about to hang up himself when he heard a soft snuffling on the other end of the line, and he realized what he was listening to was someone crying. Hello? Who is this? A pause, and then so softly he almost couldn't hear it, a voice spoke. He killed her, Elle. Hit her on the head with her. The voice broke in choking sobs, but it didn't matter. He'd heard enough to recognize it. Questions tumbled out of his mouth. Cheryl, what's wrong? Where are you? Is Jerome with you? Are you both okay? I'm at Becca's house. You know Jerome's aunt? He killed her, Elle. She's dead. It felt like his heart was suddenly encased in a grip of ice. He'd always feared that Jerome's temper would get him in serious trouble one day. In fact, he suspected it had somehow played a part in last night's car accident, though he hadn't told his parents that. They were upset enough as it was, but he'd never for a moment thought that Jerome could be capable of murder, and of one of his own relatives at that. Is he? Are you in danger, Cheryl? No, he was gone when I woke up. Woke up? Christ, what happened? Listen, you hang up and call 911 right now before he comes back. You don't understand. I can't call the police. Jerome didn't do it. Not our Jerome, anyway. Look, I can't explain over the phone. I need you to come pick me up. He took the car, and besides, I'm not in any shape to drive right now. El glanced at his mother. She was busy with another customer now and wasn't paying any attention to his conversation with Cheryl. All right. I'll make up some kind of excuse and get out of here. I've got a pretty good idea where Becca lives. Make that lived, he added mentally. But if you could be standing outside waiting for me, that'll help. Sure, no problem. It's not like I want to stay in here any longer than I have to. In here, what she left unsaid was, with Becca's body. Elle shuddered. One more thing. Once I pick you up, what are we going to do? There was no hesitation in Cheryl's voice. We're going to find Jerome and we're going to save him. Elle sighed. I figured you were going to say something like that. Jerome stared up at a star-filled sky. He was surprised to see that the afterlife appeared to have the same constellations as the world of the living. A breeze moved across him. There was wind in the afterlife, making him shiver. As he shivered, he realized that his clothes were wet, which was, of course, why the breeze made him feel cold. But if he had clothes and could still experience the sensation of cold, that meant he still possessed a physical body. And if that was the case, he sat up and looked around. It was too dark for him to make out his surroundings, but the sound of rushing water close by, not to mention the squishy mud beneath his hands, told him that he was sitting at the edge of the river, up on the bank. He wasn't dead. Somehow he'd managed to reach shore before he passed out, and the other Jerome hadn't been able to take control of his body. You blew it, you son of a bitch, he thought. I'm still in charge. He expected his other self to come back with some manner of mocking taunt, but there was nothing but silence in Jerome's skull. Maybe his other self had been chastened by his setback, but somehow that didn't feel right to Jerome. While he'd tossed and turned in the river's wild current, he'd sensed his other personality lurking just below the threshold of consciousness. But now he sensed nothing at all of his other self. It was as if Jerome was once more alone inside his own head. Was it possible that somehow the dark aspect of his self had died instead of him? Jerome didn't see how that could be, though. He hadn't drowned, his body was still alive, and he, the original personality, was still present. So what could have possibly caused the death of the other Jerome? Presuming, of course, that he was dead and not just off sulking in some corner of his host's psyche. Another breeze set him to shivering again, and he decided the matter of his other self could wait for the time being. All he wanted to do was get out of the wind and start drying off. He rose to his feet and started making his way up the riverbank, being careful not to trip in the dark. He was halfway up the bank when he realized he was no longer wearing a bandage on his left hand. And what was more, the hand didn't seem to hurt anymore, despite the severity of the burn he'd suffered. The bandage was no big mystery. He'd surely lost it in the river. But the loss of pain was less easily explained. Maybe it was numb from the cold and would start hurting once the hand warmed enough? Maybe, but the lack of pain still troubled him. It just didn't seem natural. He forced himself to put it out of his mind and keep climbing. He would worry about his hand when he was warm and dry again. After several more minutes of effort, he reached a spot where the ground began to level off, and the going became easier. He stopped and looked around, trying to get a bearing on his location. It was still too dark for him to make out more than the silhouettes of trees against the night sky, but he was fairly confident the bridge wasn't in the vicinity, which only made sense given how fast the water had been flowing. He'd probably been carried downstream quite a ways. But if he wanted to find the bridge, along with his dad's Lexus, it was simple enough. All he'd have to do was follow the river upstream, and sooner or later he'd return to the point where he'd jumped in. Then he could get into the Lexus, turn on the engine, and crank the heater as high as it would go. So he started walking. He had no idea how long he traveled, only that he was damn cold and beginning to wish his suicide attempt had succeeded, after all, by the time he reached the bridge. His discomfort was soon replaced with anger when he saw the Lexus was gone. Anger, but not raging fury. For the first time in his life, his anger didn't feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. The emotion was there, but it was less intense, more manageable. Maybe the awareness that his hair-trigger temper had been caused by his other self was enough to help him finally get control of his anger. Maybe. He shouldn't have left the keys in the ignition. Someone had driven by, probably with a passenger in the car, had seen the Lexus and stopped to check it out. When they saw it was abandoned, doors unlocked, keys dangling from the ignition, one of them had hopped behind the wheel and started the car up while the other returned to their original and, in all likelihood, much less nice vehicle. Then they'd driven away, unknowingly leaving Jerome to stand there in the middle of the bridge, freezing his ass off. He wondered how he was going to explain this to his dad. I decided to go for a little swim and figured the car would be all right until I got back. Somehow he didn't think that was going to do the trick. He'd have plenty of time to think of a better explanation on the long hike back to town. The sooner he started walking, the sooner he'd get to someplace warm. He turned towards Springwood and started walking again. From somewhere off in the darkness he heard the sound of a chattering night bird, and if the call resembled the cold, cruel sound of a certain undead madman's laughter, Jerome told himself it was just his imagination, and kept on walking. Assistant Principal Catherine LeClaire sat behind her desk, going over paperwork despite the lateness of the hour. That was one of the downsides to having the word assistant in your job title. The principal got to be the vision guy, as he so often put it, while she was relegated to handling discipline problems and completing forms. But when the principal retired, if all went well, she'd get his job, and then all these late nights would finally pay off, and she could dump all this donkey work onto her assistant principal, when she had one. Some days, far too many it seemed, this thought was the only thing that kept her going. She'd just finished approving a requisition for new gymnastics equipment for the PE department when she heard a sound in the outer office. At least she thought she'd heard a sound, like a shoe scraping across the floor. But as she listened, she heard nothing more, and she started reviewing the next form on her stack. Then came a soft tapping at her door. Almost not quite a knock, as if whoever was there wasn't sure he wanted to be heard. Catherine set aside her form, and in a clear, strong voice called out, "Who's there?" Several minutes passed as she waited for a reply. Finally, a timid voice replied, "I was told to come see you, Miss LeClaire." "It's late. Come back tomorrow." "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, but it's really important I see you tonight. Vice Principal, I'll be in real trouble if I don't." "Sure you will. That's what they all say." The door opened and Sam Nilsson stepped into her office, frowning. "What do you mean, all?" Catherine giggled. "All my many lovers, of course. They're usually lined up outside my office, down the hall, and out the main entrance." Sam's frown eased and he smiled. "No line out there tonight, Miss LeClaire." Catherine rose from behind her desk and came around to meet him. "Then I suppose I'll have to settle for you, then." She put her hands on his broad shoulders. She loved those shoulders, and he slipped his strong hands around her waist and held her gently. The feeling of him keeping his strength in check as he touched her always drove her crazy. They kissed, slow and loving at first, then with increasing urgency and building passion. Just as they were about to reach what Catherine thought of as the point of no return, she drew back from Sam, though she didn't break their embrace. "What about Nina?" she asked. "Don't worry about her. She's got garden club tonight, which means she'll be out drinking with her friends until midnight at least. We've got plenty of time." "Got any ideas on how we might spend that time?" Sam grinned. "One or two." "You've got to be kidding." "Come on, Catherine, it'll be fun. Besides, it's how the ancient Greeks used to wrestle." They stood in the gym, light set low so that most of the space in the auditorium was filled with shadow. Lying on the floor in front of them were several wrestling mats. Catherine folded her arms across her chest and eyed the mats skeptically. "I don't mind indulging in occasional role-playing, but this is a bit much." Sam came up behind her, slipped his arms around her middle, and began nuzzling her neck. "I promise to take it easy on you," he whispered in her ear. She turned around in his embrace until she was facing him. "You do, and I'll never forgive you." They kissed once, twice, and were about to zoom right past the point of no return when laughter drifted out of the shadows. Catherine froze in Sam's arms. "Who's there?" Sam demanded, no longer the ardent lover, but instead the tough-as-nails wrestling coach. The only answer he received was more laughter. Given the darkness and the acoustics of the gym, it was impossible to determine precisely where the sound was coming from. It seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Catherine stepped out of Sam's embrace even though she didn't want to let go of him. The feel of his strong arms comforted her, but it would be devastating to both their careers if their affair was exposed, not to mention what it would do to Sam's marriage. Catherine wasn't married, but once it got out that she'd had a relationship with one of the teachers, she might as well be fired. And even if she wasn't, she could forget about ever becoming principal. "Maybe it's one of the custodians," she whispered to Sam. "I don't give a goddamn who it is," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "If he doesn't show himself right now, I'm going to get him." "Try it, asshole. I'm waiting." Catherine recognized the voice. "It's Jerome Starkey," she said. "So the bastard's looking for a little payback for the other day, huh?" Catherine was afraid that their secret was going to be revealed, afraid of what Jerome, with his unpredictable temper, might do to them. But she was also disappointed. She'd hoped that Jerome might be helped somehow, that a way could be found to help him cope with his anger. But now it seemed he was beyond help. "Jerome, don't make this any worse on yourself," she called out. "Just leave and we'll forget this ever happened, okay?" She didn't like hearing the pleading tone in her voice, but she couldn't help it. "How about you two forget I'm here and get on with getting it on? I'd love to watch you wrestle, especially ancient Greek style." Then he laughed again. "Fuck you, jack-off," Sam snarled. Hands curled into fists, he started toward the darkness. Catherine put a hand on his arm to stop him. "Shouldn't we turn the lights up all the way? Wouldn't it be safer?" "Screw that! I've got nothing to be afraid of from Starkey." Sam shrugged off her hand and continued walking toward the shadows. He was quickly lost to her vision, but she could still hear the sounds of his footsteps echoing through the gym. "Come on, kid, what are you waiting for?" Sam taunted. "I'm right." His voice suddenly cut off, and then there was the sound of feet scuffling on the gym floor, followed by several dull, meaty thuds. Then the gym was silent once more. "Sam?" Catherine called. "Are you okay?" Sam didn't respond, and she began to fear that perhaps he couldn't. "Jerome, what did you do to him? If you hurt him, it'll go hard on you, I promise." She fought to keep the rising panic she felt out of her voice, but it was no use. She sounded as hysterical as she felt. A form emerged from the shadows, flying through the air and landing on the wrestling mat just in front of Catherine's feet. It was Sam. His eyes were closed and he wasn't moving. "Oh my God!" She knelt down and laid 2 fingers against his carotid artery. She detected a pulse and let out a breath, relieved her lover wasn't dead. "He's just knocked out, for now." Jerome walked out of the darkness, striding comfortably as if he were in his natural environment. Catherine continued kneeling next to Sam. She knew that she should stand and confront Jerome, use her authority and age to get him to back off, but she was too afraid. All she could do was tremble as she watched him approach. What are you going to do to me? What are you going to do with me?" The questions came out, not in the vice principal's voice, but rather the voice of a terrified little girl. Jerome stepped onto the wrestling mat and stood gazing down at her. It was difficult to tell in this dim light, but it looked as if his clothes were covered with dark splotches resembling mud, or something much worse. "Like I said, I was hoping to watch you two wrestle. I've got a special move I want to show you. It's called the Gordian Knot." Jerome reached for her, and she screamed. "You both thought you were playing it so cool, but everyone in the school, students and teachers alike, knew what you were up to. You can't keep a secret in a small town like Springwood." Catherine didn't reply. She couldn't draw in enough breath to speak. "Sorry, I had to break some of your bones, but it was the only way I could get you two to fit together. Guess I broke a few too many on Mr. Nilsson, though. Looks like he's checked out on us." Catherine, her broken limbs so intertwined with Sam's that she had no idea where he began and she ended, started to cry silently. "I tied you together pretty tight," Jerome said. "I really don't know how long you'll be able to keep breathing. If you're lucky, you might make it to morning when someone will find the two of you like this, naked and combined, into a position not covered in the Kama Sutra. If you're not lucky, well, someone will still find you. It'll just be too late to do you any good. Have a pleasant evening, Miss LeClaire." Unable to turn her head to watch him go, she could only listen as Jerome's footsteps grew quieter until they faded altogether. A moment later, the gym lights, already dim, went out completely. In the darkness, bound to the dead body of her lover, her own body in unimaginable agony from what Jerome had done to make it malleable enough to work with, Catherine concentrated on remaining calm and taking in slow, even breaths. It was a long way until morning. Jerome wasn't sure how far he'd walked. It was difficult to judge distance at night, especially outside of Springwood, where so much of the countryside looked the same. What he did know was that he was still wet, still cold, and still in need of a place to get out of this chilly night's air. A few minutes later, he saw just what he'd been searching for, a house. It was set well back from the road, but then a lot of houses out here in the country were like that. All Jerome cared about was that this house had the porch light on. With any luck, someone was home who'd take pity on a wet young man and invite him in to get dry. He started jogging so he'd reach the house all the sooner. He came to a battered mailbox on a worn wooden post set into the ground next to the end of a gravel driveway. There was no name on the side of the mailbox and no address either. Out here, people didn't need to bother with such things, Jerome thought. The mail carrier probably knew who lived in what house. Besides, it wasn't like there were all that many houses out here to begin with. Jerome hadn't seen any other lights the entire time he'd been walking. He started jogging down the driveway, gravel shifting and crunching beneath his shoes. It was too dark to make out many details of the yard, but he could see trees against the night sky, could hear crickets and nightbirds calling to one another. The more closely he listened to their calls, the more they sounded like whispering voices. He couldn't make out what words they might be saying, but they possessed a sinister undercurrent of menace, as if they were taunting him, or maybe warning him. He shrugged the feeling off with a nervous laugh. It was just the night and his imagination playing tricks on him. He kept his gaze fixed on the porch light's beacon as he ran. But the further he went, the farther the light seemed to recede, as if the house was determined to maintain its distance from him. He increased his pace until he was running full out, but still the house remained as far away as ever. Jerome's lungs burned, his heart pounded, and sweat poured off him, mixing with the river water coating his skin and making him smell like old algae and rotted fish. Finally, he couldn't keep it up any longer, and he stumbled and fell forward onto the driveway. He hissed in pain as the small stones bit into his palms and knees. Then he rolled over onto his side and rested, gasping for air. When his breathing and pulse had returned to something approximating normal, he rose to his feet and brushed pieces of gravel off his clothes. He then looked to the house and saw it lay only a few yards away. Must have been some kind of optical illusion, he thought. The house hadn't been receding from him at all. He started forward. Okay, this has been chapters 17, 18, and 19 of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege. Hope you're enjoying it so far. I'm going to be back later tonight with a couple chapters of Friday the 13th, Hell Lake, which I was going to put out tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and put it out tonight. And then I'll be back tomorrow. I think within the next 2 uploads of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protege, the book will be completed. So over the next day or two, I'm going to go ahead and complete Protege. Things are really shaping up for a good ending. I'm excited to see how it turns out. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Click that like button. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to do that. Drop me a comment. I love hearing from you guys. Click the bell so you always know when new chapters are dropping. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying thanks for listening and pleasant dreams!